Good morning, BSRT2 students. We are now on our subject, RT213 Principles of Imaging. So this morning, we will discuss the kilovolt peak, or this is the KVP. So in your operating console, you will see one of the technical factors there. So that is the kilovoltage or the kilovolt peak or KVP. But before we have an in-depth discussion, so let's just have first a short review of our discussion based on the overview of exposure factors. So lately, we have defined that KVP is the force that is applied to accelerate electrons from cathode to the anode, in which we emphasize that KVP is one of the major factors that will contribute in the production of X-rays. So the projectile electrons that travel from the cathode to the anode will be determined by the kilovolt peak. And we said that this is the force that will determine the speed of electrons as they slam into the focal spot or the area of the target which the actual source of X-ray is emitted. The second one, based sa ating former discussion, we said that KVP will produce photons wavelength that will result in penetration of the beam. Kaya nga tawag natin doon is kilovolt peak. Peak, diba? This is the highest point of the wavelength, which means we will get the highest energy of that wavelength to determine the energy of electrons that will slam into the, as we said, into the focal spot. And we said that an increase in kilovoltage will produce a shorter wavelength, which means shorter wavelength will result in a greater ability to penetrate the body tissue. Ito yung sinasabi natin, penetration power. Okay, so the shorter the wavelength, the more penetrative is the radiation. Kaya our aim here is to become or to convert that X-ray into penetrable, yung makakatagos sa human body, hindi siya ma-attenuate. In other words, when that X-ray strike into the patient, still marireceive pa rin ng ating image receptor yung X-ray na yun. Kaya the shorter the wavelength, the higher is the penetration power of the beam. The longer the wavelength, of course, the lower the penetration power. In other words, if there are longer wavelength, okay, so there will be shallow penetration. Okay? Next, we said that, of course, this is the most important, KVP controls the screen film radiographic contrast. So when we say contrast, this is the density differences on the radiographic film. So, ayun. Okay, so let's now have an in-depth discussion of the kilovolt peak. So when you heard the word kilovolt peak, so what comes into your mind? Probably voltahe, ano? So sa diagnostic radiography, when we say kilovoltage, so or kilovoltage peak, so automatic we will have in our mind is the film quality. Kasi nga before we said KVP controls the beam quality. The penetrability, yun, yung penetrating power, which is different from the beam quantity, the number of X-ray. So when one evaluates film quality, one recognizes KVP as the controlling factor of radiographic contrast. Kasi kung puro black lang ang film, black man talaga, no? O nag-iiba-iba lang ng shade. So if you're an artist, parang si KVP yung gagawa ng contour sa human body, kaya meron siyang contrast. So increases in kilovoltage peak produce more scatter radiation that will affect film adversely. So increased scatter produces more fog on the film and the contrast is reduced. Some scatter is necessary for adequate blackening. So yun. So because of KVP, nagkakaroon ng iba-ibang degree of blackening. So fast forward tayo, parang i-discuss na natin shortly yung radiographic quality. So, yung radiographic quality or film quality is different from beam quality. Kasi when we speak of beam quality, we are talking about the radiation. When we say film quality or radiographic quality, we are now talking on the X-ray film that is produced based on the different technical factors applied. So, marami ang nakakapag-contribute ng radiographic quality or beam quality. As you can see, we have three factors here. We have film factors, geometric factors, and subject factors. So, under the film factors, as you can see, meron dyang radiographic contrast. And we all know that radiographic contrast is being controlled by the kilovolt peak. Some of these factors will be discussed sooner. Okay. So, a decrease in KVP increases the probability of photon absorption. Kaya sabi natin, we have to increase KVP to become more penetrable. Photon absorption, so we are talking here of the attenuation. Pag less yung KVP, so therefore, the effect is just, it will be attenuated. Maa-absorb lang ng human body. So with lower KVP, there will be less fog on the film, resulting in an increase in radiographic contrast. Okay, so like for example here, so with lower KVP, there will be less fog on the film, resulting in an increase in radiographic contrast. Diba we already discussed this when we tackled radiographic contrast. So low KVP are applicable in the radiography of the extremities, yung mga bones of course of the upper and lower extremities like the hand, the forearm, so on so forth. So we are applying low kilovolt peak kasi hindi naman siya ganun kakapal to that will require penetration. But whereas when we speak of the chest, abdomen, skull, so technically we will apply a higher kilovolt peak that is or that will be required for bigger penetration. Kaya sa mga parts na yon, nagkakaroon or nag-i-increase ng fog ang film. So therefore, nagre-reduce yung contrast. But there's a remedy for that. 'Di ba? We have mentioned some of the factors that affect radiographic contrast. So kilovoltage is the controlling factor of the radiographic contrast. Controlling factor, so may mga affecting factors pa din naman sa radiographic contrast. Okay, so kilovoltage, we said controlling factor of radiographic contrast. At the same time, affecting factor of optical density. Whereas MAS only controls the optical density but it does not affect the radiographic contrast. What else? Okay, so now let's talk about the penetration part of the part. Okay? So the phrase penetration of the part, wag kayong maging green-minded, must be clearly understood in the application of KVP principles. So penetration of the part means the KVP selected is adequate for producing X-ray photons that have sufficient energy to pass through the part and emerge as remnant radiation to strike the film. So ito yung favorite example ko eh. So when we speak of penetration or attenuation, so this is the radiation. Halimbawang bone, di ba? Kasi this is dense or the most dense compared to water, fats, and air. So sometimes, or of course, when we apply lower radiation, there will be a problem kasi hindi siya makaka-penetrate. Whereas sa soft tissue, mas makaka-penetrate yung radiation. So what if bone talaga yung X-ray natin? So our remedy is we have to increase the energy of this photon para makatagos talaga siya doon, di ba? So yung gagawin natin is we have to increase the penetrating power. Kahit bone pa yan, kaya niyang matagos or daanan. So, ito. Kilovoltage is the factor that determines the energy of photons in the beam and penetrating power of the beam. Kaya sabi natin kanina, kailangan adequate yung energy. Hindi siya ganun kalakas, hindi naman siya ganun kahina. Kasi kung malakas, okay, so the effect is talagang magbla-block yung film, di ba? Kung talagang masyadong malakas, oo. Kaya sakto-sakto lang sa part na yun. So, an increase in kilovoltage kasi will produce shorter wavelength X-ray photons with greater ability to penetrate the body tissue. Okay, so, ayun nga, yung sinasabi natin kanina. Masyadong malakas, okay, so yung tendency is masyado na yung effect niya sa film. Kaya, saktong-sakto lang for that body. So, how are we going to do that? Okay, so ito naman, selections below 60 kVp may not be adequate to penetrate the part, and the fine markings of the skeletal tissue that comprise the bones of the knee would not be visible. Hairline fractures would be overlooked if penetration of the object were not adequate. Again, adequate penetration yung pinag-uusapan natin dito. Okay, so below 60 kVp pero may specific siya ditong body part. Sabi niya dito of the knee. Kasi baka mag-x-ray kayo ng hand tapos gamitan nyo ng 60. So, yung lalabas is talagang black. Kasi nga sabi dito sa book below 60 kV. No. Kasi every part there are how I'm going to term this one. There are adequate adequate din pala, no? There are adequate kVp just to penetrate that part. Okay, so in radiography, we don't have yet the standardized kVp values for a specific part. Kasi may mga tinatawag pa din naman tayong tawag dito, parang privacy ng mga companies. Na hindi nila talagang i-disclose yung mga yung magandang quality nito versus ganito. Kasi every type of x-ray machine, mayroon silang mga tinatawag na talagang identity nila. For example, itong brand versus itong brand. So, nagkakaiba-iba sila ng mga ino-offer na, ayun nga, na service. Especially when it comes to mga technical factors. Parang ito, mas maganda when it comes to ganito. Kaya, hindi nila masyadong i-disclose para naman meron ng in a form of mga kompetensya sa business market. So, ayun. So, again, we don't have a standardized procedure para magkaroon tayo. So, ng kVp for a specific part. So, here in radiography, so we test our technical factors. For example, sa hand, let's say sa inyong department, 40 would be enough. Of course, gagamitan muna natin ng mga experiments. So here, we will use the phantoms. Sa UEP, meron tayo si Angelo. So we use the phantom of, for example, the hand. So when you start giving 40 kVp sa hand, so what you are going to do is nag-step increment na lang tayo sa ibang parts. For example, sa next sa hand, so we can say the wrist. So the wrist, we will give 45. Sa forearm, bibigyan na natin siya ng 50 kVp. Sa elbow, 55. The shoulder, the arm, pwede nating increased again by 5. So the shoulder, pwede na natin gamitan siya ng chest radiography. Ganon yung mga nangyayari. Again, we don't have a standardized procedure for the upper extremities. Again, what I'm trying to say is we use the radiographic phantoms kasi kawawa naman yung tao kung siya yung gagamitin nating experiment. So, in many situations, kVp would not be the factor of choice to control blackening of the film. Okay, so once adequate penetration is achieved for average thickness of body part, kVp remains essentially the same even if the thickness and volume of body tissues are less than or more than average. So, mangangailangan pa din si kVp ng iba pang factor to control the blackening on the film. And as we said, this is controlled by the MAS. The MA or the MAS would serve as the major controlling factors for the blackening on the film. Tawagan natin doon optical density. So the optical density differences are or is termed as the radiographic contrast. So conditions for the radiographer at the time of the exposure are not always optimal. So alternatives in the use of technical factors must be available. So, ano-ano nga ba yung mga pwede nating gawin? So, perhaps the most difficult task for radiologic technologists involve evaluation of the patient. So, we have to see the patient's size, okay, the shape, and physical condition greatly influence the required radiographic technique factor. So, do not expect na yung mga patient mo sa radiography, mga ganito yung body type. Kasi what I'm trying to say is if that person wala namang nararamdaman na masama sa katawan, that person will not be subject for medical procedures, 'di ba? Kung talagang feeling natin healthy tayo, hindi tayo magpapa-hospital. Kaya do not expect that most of our clients ganito yung body type or condition. Oo. Once in a blue moon lang yan sa radiography na meron kayong ganyan. Not unless your clinic serves as nag-i-issue ng mga medical certificate, especially for employment. Mga ganyan yung mga patient nyo. But if your hospital is catering different medical services, of course, yung expectation natin talagang salungat sa mga ganitong katawan. So, mostly kasi yung mga kinikater natin is may mga sakit. So, most of them are, payat. Oo, may mga sakit yung hindi kaya, yung mga condition. Kaya the patient size, the shape, and physical condition greatly influence the required radiographic technique. Yung mga na-mention nga natin, we have the radiolucent and radiopaque conditions. Yun, isa yun sa mga i-consider natin. Ganito yung katawan, pero may sakit pala na tinatago, 'di ba? Yun. So that's part of our technical factors that's we have to consider. Kaya yung gagawin natin is paka-receive natin ng X-ray request, we have to see the history ng patient kung meron doon. Or yung gustong makita ng doktor na sakit. For example, ganito yung katawan, pero yung rule out niya doon is pleural effusion. So, there are fluids in the pleural cavity. So, we don't have to expect na black yung film. So, again, we have to evaluate the patient's size, okay, the shape, and physical condition. So that's one of the challenges of radiography, especially the bata, the baby of course, and versus mga ganito na nakaka-follow ng instruction. So that's also one thing to consider. Alam nga naman ang factor nito, tapos factor ng baby, hindi yan the same, di ba? So yun. Okay, so we have discussed about the patient's size and shape. So the general size and shape of the patient is called the body habitus. Ayun. So for such, again. Yan. So we have the body habitus. There are 4 such states have been described. So we have the sthenic, we have the hyposthenic, we have the hypersthenic, and we have the asthenic. So when we say sthenic, this is strong active. So these are patients that are of average size. So Boschung said this is the body of an athlete. Okay, so yung mga tipong nag-gym, yung mga average lang. Kasi naman, baka sabihin nyo, nagba-body shaming ako dito. Hindi to body shaming So, this is category based on the book. So pag sinabi nating sthenic, this is the average. So average ng Filipino versus American, magkaiba yun. So we cannot say that there is a standard body size. So yung sinasabi lang dito, yung athlete na body. So ikaw, yung makaka-gauge ka na kung ikaw active ka or not. So ikaw na yun mag-assess. So we also have hyposthenic, which means patients less or require less radiographic technique. We have hypersthenic, hyper meaning patients are big in frame and are usually overweight. And we have asthenic, patients are small, frail, sometimes emaciated, hugos masyado, yan lang kawag, and often elderly. Yung mga tipong tag mo yung friend mong tatlong ubo na lang, yun. Mga asthenic yun. So in our illustration, we can say this person is the yan, kasi may abs siya, tapos may may maganda yung tikas ng katawan niya. So we can say this is the sthenic. So ito naman kasi medyo nangangayayat siya. Yan. Yan. So we can say he is hyposthenic. Ito kasi parang napabayaan sa kusina, hindi na siya nagda-diet, masyado na siyang nag-enjoy sa kanyang quarantine sa ref. So we can say he is hypersthenic. So ayun. So maghanap tayo ng mga asthenic. Wag na lang, baka mabash ako dito, baka sabihin nagbabody shame ako. Okay? So yung mga hyposthenic, yung mga tipong emaciated na nga, sabi natin mga langkawag na. Ayun, kaka-diet, hindi na kumakain. So yung ending mga 3 days na lang kukunin na ni kamatayan. Joke. Okay, so yon ha. So we have hyposthenic, we have sthenic, and we have hypersthenic. What else? So how to compute for KVP yon? So we have to assume that we are using the variable KVP technique chart. So first, measure the thickness of the anatomy of interest using ito. This is the caliper. Parang ano ba to? Squala, ano ba yung T-square, whatever. Yun, caliper yan ha. May mga sukat yan dito sa kanyang sides in terms of centimeter, inches, and all. So, using that caliper, yung ginawa ni Iris, so measure niya si Sean. So, multiply the thickness by 2 and add the machine constant. So, remember that for every centimeter of tissue, it requires 2 kVp to penetrate. Yon, kaya penetration power. For example, nakuha dito ni, later. So, machine constant is dependent to the generator type. If the voltage generator is single or three-phase, so mag-a-add tayo ng 30 or 25 respectively is the additive factor. Sige nga, let's try. Ito. Kaya, yun yung mga ginagawa ng mga previous RadTech students natin. No? Kasi kung wala lang pandemic, probably, ginagawa din natin to ngayon. So, kayo na lang. Kuha kayo ng caliper, measure nyo yung mother at saka father nyo. Yun, baka na mapagalitan kayo. So, depende yan sa pag-measure. Kung bago-bago pa yung solution, so, mostly dito tayo sa side na to, yung mga thicker part. Pag bago-bago yung solution, mga thinner part pa tayo para, kasi ganun pa kabilis yung response ng ating developer. Yan. Pag mga medyo matagal-tagal na yung solution, so bababa tayo ng konti sa medyo may makapal-kapal na tayo. Again, girls, hindi to nagbabody shaming ha. Kung talagang feeling nyo, ganun yun yung chest nyo sa boys, hindi ko naman kasalanan yun. Oo. So, maganda nga yun, girls, kasi dalawa yung gifted kayo, dalawa yung back nyo. Meron, alam nyo na yun. Balitaw. So, yun. So, measure nyo yung part of interest. For example, ito, pang chest x-ray. So, yun. So, you are measuring the chest part of the body. So, ito yung gagawin natin. So, using the caliper, for example, the thickness was found to be 16 centimeter and the machine constant is 30. So, find the value of KVP. Again, we said that thickness. So, to find for KVP, so thickness times 2 plus the machine constant. Yan. T times 2 plus K. So your thickness is 16. So 16 times 2, that will be, magamit pa itong calculator, 32. Halimbawa, yung machine constant nyo is 30. So that will become 62. So adjust mo siya dito. Instead of 66, babaan mo siya, baba. Yan. Dito. So baba mo siya until mafahanap mo si 62. 62 kVp for that certain procedure. Again ha, depende pa din sa machine constant. Kasi kung sinabi natin dito, yung machine constant is 40, of course, that will become 72. Okay? So, ayun. Okay, naintindihan? Sige, assignment, measure nyo yung parents nyo using the caliper. Pag walang caliper, ruler. Yan. Hanapin nyo yung thickness in terms of centimeter ng chest. Tapos, multiply nyo by 2. And then, let's assume that we are using the machine constant of 30. So, hanapin nyo yung kVp. Yan, ano? So, very good. So, next. Yan. So, we will discuss the scatter radiation kasi nga yung nakatatak kasama sa kVp is the scatter radiation. So, a minimum of exposure to the patient and the highest quality radiograph are the key objectives in the selection of technique factors. Kaya, eto, may ginawa silang radiographic technique chart. Makikita nyo dito, mga students ko to dati. Kaya medyo nakaka-proud, nakagawa sila ng radiographic technique chart. So the kVp selection will affect the amount of scatter and characteristic radiation. Kaya now you know paano sila nakakome up ng kVp. Diba? So they measured using the caliper and some of the body parts, especially sa mga extremities, ito, makikita nyo dito, saan ba may mga extremities? Ito, may finger, may hand, may wrist, may forearm. So, yung ginawa nila is, kasi hindi ko nahanap na yung mga activity notebook nila. So, yung ginawa nila is, they tested it using the phantom na Angelo, yung sinasabi ko. So, when they tested it and found to, let's say, sa hand, ilan ba yung hand nila dito? Okay, so ito 40 to 50. So they tested it, tapos after ma-found out na okay kay Angelo, so in-apply nila sa human body sa actual. Ayun, so they make a range of kVp for that certain part. So the kVp selection will affect again the amount of scatter and characteristic radiation produced and the amount of radiation absorbed by the patient. Kaya kung mapansin nyo, mas maliit yung kVp sa mga extremities compared sa lumbar, sa skull. Ayan, hanapin nyo na lang. So, kung wala lang pandemic, siguro gumagawa din kayo ngayon ng radiographic technique chart. Kaya lang, again, we are restricted with our movements. By the way, class, kung may nabasa kayong little by little mag-o-open ng mga health programs, hindi pa kasama doon yung BS Radiologic Technology kasi nasa second batch tayo. Oo, so wag muna kayong maging excited na makakalabas na kayo ng inyong pamamahay at makakapunta na kayo ng school. Oo, hindi pa tayo kasama doon. Nasa second batch pa tayo. Okay, so next. So, kilovoltage is the factor in the production of scatter radiation. So, as the X-ray photons strike the body part, interactions take place. So, in diagnostic radiology, two predominant interactions occur. One is the Compton scattering and the photoelectric effect. So, ayun nga sa ating mga nabasa, so the patient is the actual source of scattered radiation. So, dito sa X-ray tube, wala namang scatter radiation pa. Yung tawag natin doon is leakage radiation. So, those radiation that are emitted in the useful segment called the window are called the primary beam or the useful beam. So, once they interact the human body, some of which do not intercept with the image receptor and are just scattered radiation. Yung mga tumagos talaga, yung mga nakapenetrate, yun yung tinatawag nating remnant radiation. Yan. So, sabi nga dito, there are two predominant interactions. One is the Compton and photoelectric effect. So, this Compton scattering and photoelectric effect will be discussed more in-depth doon sa RT212, radiation production and characteristics. Anyways, so bigyan natin siya ng a little tawag nito, bird's eye view. So reduction in KVP will reduce the Compton interaction. So which means pag higher yung KVP, more probably so Compton effect yung nangyayari. Like for example, sa chest, sa abdomen, skull, etc. So sa mga extremities naman, kasi lower KVP, yung nagaganap is photoelectric effect. For example, sa extremities, okay, sa hand, sa forearm, and all. So, reduction again in kilovoltage will reduce Compton interactions. However, another type of interaction called the photoelectric effect may occur. So, the photoelectric effect becomes more prominent when lower energy X-ray photons are present. Yung sinasabi ko na nga kanina. For example, sa extremities because we are applying low kilovoltage. So, scatter photons may account for as much as 50 to 80% of photons exposing the film. So, in other words, the higher the kilovoltage, the higher is the nawala ang term, the tendency that your X-ray film will become blacker. 50 to 80% of the photons will expose the film. Okay? So, in general, the higher KVP settings reduce the amount of radiation absorbed by the patient. So, scatter radiation lang. Higher KVP selections will also increase the amount of scatter radiation exposing the film. So the energy of X-ray or the scatter radiation will be greater, increasing the chance that it will exit the patient and reach the film. Okay, so there is a remedy for that. So madidiscuss natin 'yan sooner or later. Actually, nabigyan na natin ng slight na discussion when we talk about the grid. Ito yung pinaka-ultimate solution natin to scatter radiation. Okay, so that's all for today, di ba? So, if you have questions, again, alam nyo na yan kung paano nyo ako mahahagilap sa mundong ibabaw. So, do not hesitate. So, this has been your teacher, your professor, your instructor, your vlogger, and all. So, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have learned something today. So, next week, we will discuss MA or MAS. So, see you again. Goodbye.